no, Jana goes.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. To speak, yeah. So we're going to turn this meeting over to Mr. McCausland immediately to, as he brings up his presentation, to walk us through the next revision of the budget. We had another, the previous meeting was in January, correct? I believe it was? February. We walked through the first revision, so Mr. McCausland has been doing a lot of pencil sharpening on this version, and he's going to walk us through the current state and changes of his proposed budget for 2021-2022.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. You reminded me, I already forgot. So for everybody in the viewing this online, the proposal for the budget is found in Board Docs. To get to Board Docs, if you don't have that link bookmarked, go to the Bethel Park website, the school district website, and under School Board, on the right-hand side, as you scroll down a little bit at the bottom, you'll find a link that will take you to Board Docs. Once you're on Board Docs, go to this meeting, and there is a item number 3 called Review of the 2021-2022 Proposed Final General Fund Budget Draft. If you click on that link, you'll see the option to download the PDF file with the current proposal. Okay, Mr. McCausland, it's yours.
Okay. This is by all means interactive. If you have questions along the way, feel free to just ask along the way. And if you want to discuss something in more detail, please feel free. We'll try to provide the information you wanted. And we'll go from there. So where do we stand right now with our updated projections? They haven't changed a ton. They've done tweaks slightly, but we're still on track, as you can see from this slide, to finish with $1.3 million additional funds for the end of the year, while you had budgeted a $5.3 million loss. It looks like you're going to end up to the positive. That positive variance is really the result of all the additional CARES funding that we received, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We did a significant access drawdown. We had talked about that before, that it hadn't been drawn down for many years. So we did that as well. There's still some funds left there, but we did draw down, I want to say, close to $800,000 worth of money that was sitting there. It was quite substantial. We did have some increased delinquent and EI tax collections that were over the budget. And again, remember that we did that extended term financing for the Chromebooks, so that shows up as a revenue proceed that you hadn't anticipated as well, because the full amount of the lease amount gets put in as revenue. Again, it's offset by the debt service, but your first debt payment on that is until next fiscal year, so you had a net positive as a result of that. Expenditures on the savings side, we're saving money on the expenditure side because we have a lot of overtime that hasn't really been paid out this year because we've been mostly remote. Also, transportation costs are down. In fact, we liquidated some fuel a few weeks ago because we weren't going to use it all and other school districts were running short. So we were able to dump some of that and recoup some of that money back so that we didn't run over, because according to our contracts, if you don't use all the fuel that you allotted, you were still on the hook to pay for it. But since we had people that wanted to use it, we were able to sell that. So we recouped that money back as well. Also, substitute costs, we really haven't had a great need for substitutes, and you have substantial dollars, almost $700,000 sitting in your budget to pay for substitutes that really wasn't tapped into. Obviously, we haven't used as many supplies either because we've been mostly remote. There hasn't been a need to buy a lot of additional paper and items because people are doing things electronically. Questions about that?
Do we have a number on CARES money that we've received compared to CARES money that's still outstanding?
Yeah, I have a slide coming up talking about the CARES funding.
Just to clarify the fund balance here again, that includes the capital portion of the fund balance also?
That does not. That's just the general fund.
Just the general.
I have slides included at the end. We'll talk about capital reserve as well. This is just the general fund. The 2021-22 budget, where do we stand now? I put the figures in there that we were at in February, just so you had a comparison to show you that we have been working diligently on this. Where we stood at $1.3 million deficit. One second. Okay, where we stood at a $1.3 million deficit in February is now down to about $780,000. What have we done since then? Well, I was able to meet with all the building principals, all the department chairs. We went through their detailed budgets. We trimmed some things. A lot of it, quite honestly, has been done with tightening up some different contracts. We also have done a lot of shifting around with staff. We did get some retirees that put notice in, so we were able to lower some salaries and benefits because of that. And then we're playing around with some other staffing changes that I'll talk about in a little bit.
Okay. So I see that the revenue went up by about $2 million.
Yeah, that again is
that
pretty much CARES funding again. That's
Oh, it
additional
is.
CARES 2 and 3 money that's going to be released to school districts. It's not the full allotment, but that's why it went up significantly, because there's some big dollars coming.
Oh, so we're expecting CARES funding for the next school year also?
Yes.
Not just, okay,
Yes.
okay.
So this really represents an increase in spending of 7.6%, but if you back out the additional ESSERS or CARES funding, you're really at about a 5.7% increase. Again, that's over actuals, not budget to budget, because remember we talked last time about the fact that I don't like to do budget to budget. I don't think it really gives you a good picture. You look at actual trends and build your budget based on prior actuals or estimated actuals. So, if you were looking at budget to budget, that number would be even lower. It'd probably be closer to 2.5% to 3%. But because our spending has been so much lower this year, it looks like we're increasing costs a lot when we're really not
Right.
increasing them dramatically. So it's a little bit misleading. What else do and again, primary increases are due again to personnel costs, books and software and technology replacements, and we'll talk about those in a little more detail in a few slides. Okay, right now, this budget that is $780,000 out does still have a 3.5% tax increase included in it to get you to that point, which is a 0.76 mil increase. And then you can see how the tax assessments are increasing, and nothing really has changed a whole lot in this slide since February. The median tax household is $151,000, which means that your taxes would go up $116 for the year. 1 mil will generate about $2.5 million. Questions about that? So this slide really hasn't changed.
Is that's the max allowable?
That is our
index?
PDE index limit, yes. You had asked me to do this scenario slide, so you had some range. If you didn't do any tax increase, what would the deficit look like? It would be about a little over $2.7 million. And then you can see graduating up how you, when you increase a 0.5% or 1%, what happens to the deficit. Again, the tax increase that's listed there in that center column is based on the median household value of $151,900.
And with this millage increase, it still does not get us to where in the June of 2019, the change in the reduction in the millage rate happened,
It's
correct?
a great question. Here are your millage history. And yes. It gets you all max. It gets you back to almost where you were in 2018-19, so 3 years ago. Almost, not quite.
How long would it take to not have a deficit years out if you continued at the end?
If we continue at the pace we're doing with cost controls, you could be balanced without a tax increase. You're probably talking about 2 years out.
Okay.
But, 2 years can be a lifetime, so we'll see where we end up. We are starting, like I showed you those long-range projections, I
Right.
think it was about 2 years if you went to the index, assuming the index stays around 3.5. Okay, CARES funding. The CARES funding has come in several forms. The first round of CARES funding came through the PCCD grants. The first amount was about $280,000 that we got last spring. All of that money was used for PPE, sanitizing, sanitizing equipment, and some of the virtual learning platforms that we were using. This next round was from PCCD PCCD Safe Schools, which was $115,000. And we used that again for additional sanitizing things. We paid for Power School registration. They purchased some plexiglass and laptops for the non-public schools, which was required under that grant. And then the biggest item we purchased was a weight room sanitizing system that sanitizes the weight rooms automatically every evening. Then the special education mitigation grant, I think you remember that we hired a bunch of additional staff or tutors to help with the learning gap with special education students. That's what that money was used for. It was a little over $12,600. That program, I believe, has started and will continue on while the funds last. ESSERS 1, which we are in the midst of spending right now, is $192,000. We have added additional bus proctors because of the additional traffic at the elementary schools, so some of the funding is used to pay that. There has been additional social worker and SAP liaison services that were purchased that some of the funds were used for. We hired a intern from Carnegie Mellon to help us with the Schoology platform. He is still working with the district. And then we purchased some additional virtual platforms. And then we had to also a portion of it for non-public schools, which were mainly to purchase laptops. Not all of those funds have been expended, but the majority of it has. And we have received about half of that funding. On the other ones, we have received the funding already.
So you have a 2022 by that one. Does the revenue hit our budget in 2022, but
It's actually,
doing the expenses
those numbers
now?
I thought were correct, and then I corrected my presentation tonight. It's
Oh,
actually
okay.
2021. We have to use all the ESSERS funds by September.
Okay.
So those were off by 1 year on the board
I see,
presentation.
okay. So the 1.2 million is a part of the revenue that's in the
Next
previous
year's
chart
budget.
that you showed us.
Correct. So we haven't really submitted the budget for the next two because the guidelines are just coming out and the budgets are just being released. So we are in the process of addressing how we're going to spend those funds. We do know, however, with ESSERS 2 and 3, 20% of the funds that are allotted us will have to be used to address learning loss of some way, whether it's summer programs, after-school programs, other software they can use to do additional learning beyond that, remediation of some type. But we have to come up with a plan to use 20% of the funding, and if you look at those numbers, that's about $717,000 that has to be allocated at least as a minimum to learning loss. You can use more of it, but you have to use at least a minimum of that. We are also planning to address a lot of the environmental issues with capital projects in our school. We want to avoid using it for ongoing operational items. We consider this more like one-time fund balance money. So a lot of the projects that we'll talk about with the capital projects and we've already talked about with the feasibility study, window replacements, water issues that are going on. Those types of issues, we can use this money to help us fund those projects and get those paid for. So as much as we can do in the capital project realm, we want to use that money. There's some HVAC issues with IMS and with NAMS, some chiller issues. So if we can use that money to fund those projects, that's what we're looking to do.
Yeah.
We know that we can't do them all over this summer, but we do have until 2023 to use all of that money. So, we'll plan accordingly with our schedule on how those projects are going to be mapped out so that we can spend the funds by that date. Questions?
Could you just back up to slide 5 a second? Because I
Sure.
think it's worth explaining this, because what we're after is a sustainable, a sustainable budget, okay, to the positive side. Back up one more, sorry. Yeah. So where you have a 0% tax increase of 2.7 million, if we look at this based on sustainable numbers, that CARES grant is not there. So what we're really saying is that we're about 4 million. 4 million would be our deficit roughly without the CARES money. Okay, and so that's the number we really got to be looking at, because that money goes away after 2 years, and so we've got to be thinking about how do we get our budget balanced by that time, basically, because this deficit number is going to get effectively, $1.5 million.
The one thing to remember is that, again, that CARES money, while it's in there as a revenue, there's offsetting expense in there.
Oh, there is?
Yeah, there's an offsetting expense in the budget.
Okay,
So
so
they're
you
kind of
have put the
neutral. So this
expenses
number
in
is
there.
really closer to that 2.7.
Okay, that's a good clarification. So you have factored in the expenses for all the things
Absolutely.
that are, okay.
Absolutely.
Well, that actually puts us in a better sustainable position
Yes.
then.
Yeah, you'll see I added some transfers to the capital projects to cover some of those things. I have, I think, $500,000 in there for summer programs and additional programs for next year. While I didn't
Okay.
think we'd spend it all, the 700 and something in 1 year, I put about that much in, and then I offset it with the revenue that I anticipated we'd
So we have
draw
additional
down.
expenses because
they
of the
balance
CARES
each other out.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know. That actually does put our
Yeah, you're in
budget
better-
situation in better shape.
I mean, when we started this in January, we were about almost 5 million negative.
Yeah.
So a lot has happened over the last several months to narrow this down. And part of that process
Actually,
was
your process that you laid out, the zero budgeting
Mm-hmm.
and everything, you should take credit for that because you've kind of disguised the input you've had, I think, from going through that process because of the CARES thing, but that's remarkable.
Right. I mean, your goal was initially to cut $2 million of that deficit out.
Right.
So we implemented what we call a zero-based budget. And so every building and every department and every grade level got a spreadsheet, and they had to build their budget from zero. They had to justify everything they put in their budget. And a lot of the meetings that I had with department heads and principals was really about, okay, the last 5-6 years, you've used this much in this line item, and now you're asking for 3 times that amount next year. Why? Well, and so we'd have a conversation. Now, there might be a time when, yeah, we're doing something special, we have new projects going on. There are reasons for those variances and fluctuations, and that's fine. That's
Yeah.
what I'm looking for, because it shouldn't be the practice historically of, this is what I've always had, this is what I get, plus I want another 2% on top of it. That's not the philosophy we took this year. And I think
Right.
it was eye-opening for people when they started to look at it and realized, oh, okay, I am getting what I need, and it's not costing as much as I thought it would. So,
Right. Well, I think we also had a practice where we typically would budget and then come in 2 million, 3 million under what we budgeted. And some people may look at that as a great job. I don't. I think it actually causes you to make bad decisions during the year on things that you maybe should have invested in. And so, because they're always kind of surprised as you get to the end of the year and, oh, we're 2 million to the plus side. Where'd that come from? Okay. And I just, again, I believe it's a bad thing because you tend to make bad decisions during the year.
Right.
I mean, and for the public too, most of the time corporations start with a zero budget and build up based on what they know is coming in, so they're not at a deficit. And
Yeah, and we didn't, you always hear the rumor about padding your budget, but we really tried to avoid that because in your budget this year, we put a line that was called budgetary reserve. We put that centralized because now we can make the decision about whether that's something additional we really should invest in or if it's not
Right.
something we should invest in. So there's not a lot of need to pad in a lot of areas because, sometimes there's unknowns and you do a range and you try to be conservative in that range. But for the most part, we're pretty methodical in the types of things we buy and what we do and the services we provide. So
Right. Good.
there's not a ton of fluctuation.
Good. Well, I just, again, great job, because you did a lot more in terms of improving our budget situation than what's probably shown in the numbers on these slides because of kind of the masking from the CARES
Right.
money that came in.
Thank
So,
you.
nice job.
This next slide is really kind of getting to what I think you were talking about, Mr. Christensen. It's the revenue trends. You can see the bars in blue are where you budgeted revenue, and the orange is where your revenues actually came in. So obviously, the higher the orange above your blue, the bigger the variance. And when I looked at your, especially your collection rates for your taxes, they were pretty conservative in nature, and it's not a bad thing. I don't think you should get crazy, but you consistently have been close to 97 or higher percentage collections as far as a collection rate, and you have always exceeded what you budgeted to what you actually collected. So it
Okay.
tells me you were probably being a tad too conservative, so you did pick up some revenue because I was slightly more aggressive on the collection rate than
Sure.
in the past. So
What were our collection rates over the last, I guess, 8 months in this tax cycle, or 7
As
months?
far as actual to where you budgeted,
Yeah.
you were collecting always over 100% of what you budgeted.
Okay.
The rate of actual collection was probably close to 97 to 97.5% or slightly higher.
Okay.
Most of the time you were budgeting a collection rate of somewhere around 95.5 to 96%.
So even
that
in
1% can make a
2020, fall of 2020, because we had some concerns just because of, unemployment rates and things like that, but we still held at a pretty high rate.
You exceeded again your collections. yes.
Okay.
You've already done that. You already passed it.
Okay. Good. Good.
Did the same thing on the expenditure side. Obviously, I had the detail, but I just did the graph for you here. But again, blue line is what you budgeted your expenditures. Orange bar is what you actually spent. In most years, especially when you look at 15, 16, you were pretty close. 17, 18, I don't know what happened there, but you did exceed what you budgeted. I don't know if there was additional grant money that came in for something that wasn't anticipated. You could have had to, spend it on those types of things. I haven't been able to dig into that too much. But in recent years, you can see that your spending has been far below what you've been budgeting. And part of that in the last 2 years, quite frankly, is probably COVID related. So, but looking at the individual variances, I can see, again, when we looked at the actuals and drilled down, we were able to identify a lot of cost areas where we were over-exaggerating expenditures, much more than we needed to.
Yeah.
So we tried to tighten that up. I think that will get better over time as I get a few more years' experience and kind of know the history of what's going on here. Looking at it at first glance, I think we did a decent job of finding those. I'm sure we'll find more as we go through.
Sure.
So 17, 18, I may be mistaken, but I believe that's the school year, we expanded the school police force and added school police officers and equipment, so that
Okay,
made
could have been. And sometimes you get large grants that you didn't anticipate, but you have to spend the money, so that might have caused you to be over as well. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I would assume that's probably what happened. Did the same thing trending fund balance. If you look at 14-15, and 15-16, you were projecting a balanced budget. You ended up actually adding to your fund balance in small amounts. Then you start the trend with 16-17, where you were projecting a deficit, your fund balance, you were submitting a budget where your expenditures exceeded your revenues, but yet you still added to the fund balance. 17-18, again, you were projecting a deficit, but you really didn't have any change. You came in pretty close to being break even. And then 18-19, projecting a small deficit, but yet had a pretty large increase in fund balance. 19-20, last year, you're projecting a pretty large loss in fund balance, but your loss was not very large at all. It was negligible. And then again, this year, we're projecting a large decrease in fund balance, but right now I'm projecting to have an increase of slightly of $1.3 million.
The last two, this current year and last year, is a lot of that due to the pandemic and not spending?
Yeah, I think
I mean,
that's
we still had to
largely that.
fulfill salaries and those kinds of things, but there were a lot of other items that were not.
Yeah, I think it's largely due to the pandemic because, again, you didn't have staff in the buildings, you weren't paying for a lot of extracurriculars, you weren't paying for subs, and you were getting additional CARES money to help fund the purchase of a lot of the PPE products and things like that. So I think that's really what you're seeing there in those 2 years. Probably if you hadn't had that happen, you probably would not have seen such a rosy picture.
Right.
So in many ways, I mean, while we hated the pandemic, it kind of helped us financially a little bit. It's sad to say. It took that, but
Right. I mean, not a great solution.
Doug,
but
is
no,
there-
it's not a great solution.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Is there any one item you would point out, or is it just a combination of a bunch of, like you said, substitutes, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's largely that, those big ticket items, those subs that you didn't pay for, some of the services, we got some refunds on insurance because we weren't driving buses and we didn't, and our workers' comp claims, since we didn't have people working in the buildings, our workers' comp carriers were giving us pretty significant rebates.
Okay.
So a lot of that is really out of the norm in a typical year, so it definitely helped your financial picture.
Sure.
So what you're saying is 2 years down the road from now, if we don't continue, as the auditors even said, with the tax increases and those kinds of things, this picture is not going to be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's spot on. I think you're going to probably see those blue lines and orange lines negative and probably matching a lot closer than they are.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, major expenditures, nothing new here. I didn't really put a lot of detail on here other than you see that personnel makes up 75% of your budget, and then followed by debt and tuition as your other big items. This is it.
On the tuition, have we, I know we talked a few months ago about doing some either surveys or telephone calls to the people who were doing cyber school. Have we done that? Do we have a
Yeah,
feel
Mr.
for how many
Linoski
people?
was reaching out to those
Okay.
those families. I haven't spoken to him in the last week, but I know he was making some calls to families to see. Right now, we're spending a little over $5.5 million in tuition this year, which is one of our line items we're struggling with. But we're planning that to return back to about $3.6 million next year because a lot of the families have indicated, I think, that they're coming back.
They're coming back, okay.
So here are the numbers again. Major expenditures, personnel makes up about $71 million of your $94 million budget. And you can see the numbers going down through debt, tuition are the other top ones. Supplies, books, and software come in at $2.8 million. That big transfer number, again, is some of the CARES money right now. It may end up in the general fund as an actual line item before I get done with this, but for now, I wanted to put a placeholder in there, and this was the easiest place to put it until I had more detail about what we were going to actually do. So I did want it in there, at least so we had the number in the budget. Utilities are about 1.3, a little under 1.4 million. And then the equipment, a large portion, the major portion of that is really the replacement of 2,200 student devices, laptops, Chromebooks, whatever they may be. We plan on doing those updates probably in 2 different leases, probably a 4-year lease and a 3-year lease, so that we can start a cycle, so we're not going to end up in 3 or 4 years having to replace them all again at the same time. So we are working on a phase-in plan as far as being able to rotate the leases so that we can get to a more consistent number in our budget. So we just had a meeting about that today, and we're working on finalizing those numbers by next week. There's been a lot of discussion about PC versus Chromebook, so we're still working through that. I know there was a big survey that went out to teachers. They're getting feedback from the staff. And then there's a big discussion about whether we're going to have labs or not have labs, or some labs and not other labs. So there's been a ton of discussion about how we're going to manage it in the platforms moving forward, trying to look for that consistency that we're talking about so that we're not managing a million of platforms and a million different devices, that we have some consistency. So that's the goal. Professional services, mainly special ed, sub-services, remember that educational loss component of ESSERS is in there for $500,000. Testing costs, legal, audit, all those other things that we get professional services for make about $3.7 million. And then you see some minor things for repairs, communications, and some other smaller items. Yes.
Doug, can I ask a question? Where does our insurance fit into this?
Your insurance would actually be a $500 expense, and I didn't itemize it out. You pay about $138,000 for your insurance coverage.
I mean, but which would
It would be under the other.
Other,
down there at the
I
bottom.
assumed that.
Yeah.
Are we close to that time period in the year?
I am getting renewals. That's one of the things I'm still waiting for, so your numbers may change. But yes, we're out to market for our liability coverages, our commercial coverages, and our workers' comp. So
No,
we haven't got the new rates yet, but that we should be getting them pretty soon.
And that's, do we go out to everyone or just to the same carrier, or how does that work?
There's only a handful of carriers that really do the school business. But yeah, our broker takes those out to market, and then they bring back the quotes.
But, so we don't shop it with other brokers at all, we just use the same person?
You had an established broker when I got here. If you want to switch a broker, you would have to do that by board action. But at this point, I didn't think it would make much difference. I think you're using AJ Gallagher as your broker, and they're pretty widely known. They have connections with all the major insurance carriers in the business. So they're a good company. I've worked with them in the past as far as a brokerage firm. We can certainly look at other options for brokers for other types of insurance if you want, but we'd have to issue a letter saying that they are a broker of record.
Yeah, I'm by no means an expert in insurance, but my understanding is the way you save money in this program is to go out and find all the best sub-insurers of the products and services that we need. And a lot of times brokers will only give you a discount on their commission to, so I mean, I guess that's my concern. Can we save more money if we look in another direction versus just going back to the same person year
I
after
don't
year
know
after
how long
year?
you've had AJ Gallagher. I was under the
Less
impression.
than 5 years, I would guess.
Okay. So, maybe next year is a good year to look at possible different brokers if you wanted to, and have them farm it out to a different group of people. But I can certainly interview brokers and see who has what their technique is as far as farming it out. It's certainly something to look at.
Yeah, we're looking to save money in every direction we
Yeah.
can. And that's the reason I bring it up. I didn't know if it was too late to do that, or we were already.
It's a little late now. I think if you're going to look to farm that out to someone different, you should probably start those talks somewhere in the fall, because you really want to start planning your renewal sometime in February, which I've already done. And they go out there, and the quotes should be coming back, I would think, in another week or two.
So one of you guys have to ask that question next year.
I mean, no, that's fine. I mean, I'll make a note of it, and I have no problem. I've done it before. We switched when I was at Ambridge, and we switched when I was at Fox Chapel, so it's not a new process for me. It's just, it wasn't high on my list for this year around. I had too many other things to,
Doc,
but it's certainly something to look
Yeah.
at.
under tuition, is that where AIU services or Steel Center, where do those?
That would include still set your VOTEX and any of the charter schools and private
under
parochial
tuition?
schools.
That's
Yeah.
what I thought.
Well, private schools, we don't pay parochials. Okay. Under personnel, since the last time we met, we've had 5 teacher retirements. Replacing those staff members would saves us about $351,000. They're still looking at the staffing for next year and the different positions that are opening and student class size and those types of demand tallies. So if we end up not replacing everyone, for each one we don't replace, let's just say we save an additional $94,168. If you didn't replace all 5, it would be $470,000 in savings. So just to give you an idea of the difference between when you replace someone, what you save, and when you don't replace someone, if you looked at both of those numbers, it's about a little over $165,000. So it's a lot of money.
Long-term, though, replacing them and not replacing them, the not replacing them is going to basically be reoccurring. Replacing them, there will be some savings for the
There is. There's
future
about a
because of a lower
$70,000 savings for every teacher you replace because you're moving them from top step to first step. So
Right.
there's savings
But
there.
that
And-
decreases every year also because they move up steps.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
just so I'm reading the numbers correctly, the way you've got it phrased, if you do not replace, you save the sum of that, so about $800,000.
If you do not replace, you would save, the 470 plus the 350.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's an additional amount on top of what
That
you
you
already
save,
saved.
yeah.
The 350 is already in the budget as a savings. If we end up not replacing them, we'll save an additional 94,000 for each teacher we don't replace.
Okay.
And then the same thing with the paras, the same number, you see them work out there. There's 4 right now. The one thing I will tell you that we could still get additional retirements, but I wanted to let you know that we have started a new process in the district. Tony's been very helpful in getting the process started. We now have a process that when a teacher retires, or any staff member retires for that matter, it doesn't have to be a teacher, it could be para, it could be a custodian, it could be an administrator. There is a form that must be completed by the direct supervisor of that employee that justifies if that position needs to be replaced. So
Okay.
there's an entire conversation and an entire process for justifying the replacement of a position. We do not automatically assume we're going to replace the position when someone goes.
Does,
We look at our existing staff and what they're doing and who they're working with to try to determine whether it's something we need to replace or whether
Good.
it can be covered with existing personnel.
so, the way you worded that justifies, like, why not to replace them? Does it also, or why to replace them? Does it go both ways? Like, does it show justification for replacing them as well as justification for not replacing them?
Can I answer that?
Go ahead, yeah.
The reason I'm asking, I don't want it to be focused on not replacing. I want it to be focused on what's best for the kids.
Yeah, so
So whether it
the
is
form where he's referring to, we're calling it a job requisition.
Okay.
So if the administrator, the supervisor wants to replace the position, they have to requisition it through the HR department with this justification form and support it with data. If it's a teaching position, what are the class size needs or the enrollment or the course tallies, that sort of thing. So if they don't need to replace it, then the requisition isn't filled out.
Okay.
So it only works on the request end.
Yeah, that's a bit where my concern is we have had a focus in the past on shrinking staff, and the justification for not replacing wasn't, I don't feel was always there. So my concern is if we don't require a justification for not replacing, do we get caught in that trap again where we automatically shrink the staff unless we justify, as opposed to looking at justifications both ways?
It's sort of working from the zero-based budgeting mentality that you've endorsed here with the business manager. So you operate from the assumption that the position has to be justified to get it, as opposed to justifying not getting something. So it's basically working from the zero-sum game that we're not giving it to you until you justify the need. So you're right, it's alternative thinking to what you just described, but I think it's in line with Doug's overall financial mentality that we're going to work with zero, and you got to go up from zero based on your needs and your data, how you support that.
Okay. We are also looking, and this is not in the budget right now, but we are working, we've worked the last several weeks at reworking how the security staffing in the district works. And we believe there is potential savings there of about $180,000 over what we're doing now. So we'll have more for you on that once we get it finalized, but we're getting close to having a good plan in place. We'll talk about that more later. We also have looked at all the supplemental assignments. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to really clean that up the way we want to clean it up. That'll probably become part of contract negotiations with the teachers when the time comes. But we are looking at those assignments and how we can potentially rework some of the things that are being done in there. There is substantial savings, and when you start to look at those numbers for all the additional amounts you pay, it starts to get rather significant. I mean, to the tune of, $2 or $3 million that you're paying out in additional monies. So it does deserve a good look through and really understanding what they do, how the rates were determined, do they make sense, do they line up with everyone else. I don't expect a ton of things this year, but it's something that's going to be a significant ongoing project so that we are ready to address it head on next year when we're talking to teachers.
You're referring to the extra duty or extra period pays?
Yeah, extra
like a
duties,
6 period,
supplemental
7 period?
assignments, coaching
Yeah.
assignments, sponsorships, those types of things.
Right.
When they cover an extra class, when they take on a 6th period, those types of things that are in contractual obligations. But those are all things I think we need to look at. Your bus proctors, your lunch proctors, it starts to add up pretty quickly. So we're not quite sure where we're going to end up with there. I don't think suspect any sweeping changes for next year, but certainly as you talk about your strategic plan, your feasibility study, how we're going to configure moving forward, I think all of those things we're going to need to have a good handle on so we can make good cost projections. And then also just to remind you that we are still negotiating the custodial maintenance agreement. We've built obviously increases in, but those are subject to change. We are getting closer with that, but again, we'll talk about that more in an executive session. This just relates to staffing, and I think you've seen some stuff like this before. This just gives you a comparison of teachers compared to the student ratio. So when you see that gold line across the top, you can see for Bethel Park, we are slightly increasing our student to teacher ratio, meaning that, as your enrollment is declining, you actually have more students per teacher.
Invert, as we've been reducing staff, and I think our students have been relatively flat. So as we've been reducing staff, our ratio of students to teachers have been going up.
Correct. And you
it's
can
probably
see
both,
where that,
a little
where
bit
that,
of both.
Yeah.
A little bit of both. As your enrollment goes down and
That'll push it
the
the
number
other
of
way.
staff stays the same, then the ratio goes up.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have remained fairly level in that regards, and you can see where Mount Lebanon, Peters Township, Upper St. Clair are in comparison. They obviously have slightly more students, and it's hard to compare sometimes Mount Lebanon to Bethel Park, even though I know they're our neighbors. But they also have a lot more students enrolled, so they're going to have more staff. The next,
Well, I mean, but you've got it set up as a comparable metric, okay? And ours, and this is professional teaching staff, not pairs or anything like that, right?
That's correct. It's
So-
just the teachers.
I mean, what this says is that, we've got, well, you have to do the math for the whole school, but when I've calculated this before, it probably says that we have about 30 more teachers on our staff than, say, Mount Lebanon would at the same
On a per
student-to-teacher
student.
ratio.
Right.
So,
And again, this is the same type of metric. All this does is we pulled out similar enrollment size districts and similar economic status districts as Bethel Park across the state.
yeah.
And so it gives you probably a better comparison to districts that are similar to you across the state.
Yeah. I like these metrics. They're probably less valuable from an annual budget planning process, much more relevant to a strategic planning process or long-term planning process, because these aren't things that you fix overnight.
Correct.
And you don't want to be in the position where you have to, otherwise you're going to create incredible stress.
And I only insert it there because we've been talking about staffing, and I just wanted to let you know that we're starting to look at these kind of
Yeah.
data points
That's
now
good.
that we haven't looked at in the past. So it's helping us as we plan into the future.
Right. That's
Doug, isn't Radnor on the main line in Philadelphia?
Yeah, it's out near Philly, yeah.
But it's on the main line, which is, I would say it's probably a little wealthier than, of a community than Bethel Park is.
Yes and no. I mean, I went to undergraduate school on the main line, so is Great Valley.
Some of
Yeah, I
them.
know, but Radnor's not as far out.
Right, right.
This slide just gives you a list of equipment purchases that are included in the district budget for this year. So you can see that the largest portion of it is obviously laptops and projectors, as I indicated. There's some other bigger items in there. I just found out today, like the tractor's not going to be $24,000. It's going to be about half of that. So there'll still be some adjustments as we get numbers finalized on some of this equipment, but there's not a lot of extravagant equipment in there. The treadmills that we're replacing are over 15 years old. They're not functioning at all. So I think it's time to replace them. And I don't know. I just wanted you to have that information because it's often a question I get.
$1,000 for a baritone saxophone.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I like the music department and all, but I don't even think I paid $1,000 for the trumpet that mine plays.
Well, they had originally requested a lot more, so. Special ed expenditures, because that's another big ticket item. I just wanted to do a couple slides showing you the impact of special ed costs on your budget. It makes up about 16% of your total budget, or a little over $15 million. Again, the bulk of that is for personnel. And then professional services are things like costs for the AIU to service different programs. Again, you have tuition, students that are going to charter schools or other private placements outside the district, and then a small portion for actual supplies, books, field trips, and some minor repairs if equipment needs repaired.
Were any of these headcounts included in the staffing ratios?
Yes, we
previously?
included special ed teachers,
Okay.
elementary, secondary.
Okay, well, and, okay, that's good. And probably it's more appropriate when we go through the strategic planning process, but we may want to do a little
We can also
bit-
filter them out and just look at them exclusively.
Yeah, or do a little bit of normalization, because I think our percentage of special ed students in Bethel is probably 50% higher than, say, Upper St. Clair, and probably over twice as high as what I've seen in Peters.
Yeah, we could pull out the
So-
enrollment numbers and look at
It-
those as well.
And it's an explanation, or at least it's a valid normalization of why maybe our student-to-teacher ratios could be a little bit lower. That may be one of the drivers, but it's just important to understand what are those drivers, or how do we explain variances? And if we can't explain them, then we should get rid of the variances.
Yeah, I think that's, I started looking at some of that, and this slide basically just shows you special ed costs per student. You can see that Bethel Park is up there. It's about a little under 15%.
Before we move past the ratios, could we, in our next meeting, possibly have general ed ratios separated from special ed as well as electives for the staff-student ratios. That way we can see what our staff-student ratios are in comparison to other districts in the general ed classes.
I can see what I can do. This just gives you it as a percentage, and then the grid to the right kind of gives you the actual cost. So when you look at it as a percentage of the total costs on a cost per student basis, we are, up there in the IU, but when you look at the actual dollars, we probably are falling a little more toward the middle of the pack. Other than a take from that, I can drill down into this, and I realized as soon as I started to drill down, and I didn't put the slide in here, but largely due to your salaries again. Remember, we talked about the fact that you have 70+% of your staff sitting at the top of the scale. So that's driving that number more than anything else.
Yeah.
When I look at the numbers drilled down. A little bit about fund balance. I didn't put anything else in here other than to give you the numbers again on where we're projecting to be at the end of the year as far as unassigned fund balance. Again, that cannot exceed 8% of your total expenditures. Your non-spendable are your prepaids for healthcare and inventories. Right now, you have committed fund balance for a legal trust. You have retiree severances, tax refunds, and retiree benefits. You have assigned amounts for capital projects, copier replacement, band uniform replacement, and right now there's nothing we anticipate for a budget deficit. It may end up having a small amount in there when we get done, but we're hoping to get this closer to balanced with the tax increase by May.
In the capital projects, did we switched the turf and things like that?
The turf is still in capital reserve. Again, that $3.8 million, if you choose to, can be assigned to something else, or it could be transferred to the capital reserve if you choose to do so. The only reason it was kept there is because it gives you more flexible to reassign or commit as you need to. And you have over $9 million or $10 million sitting in the capital reserve right now. Once you move something to capital reserve, it has to stay there. It cannot come back. So it doesn't provide you as much flexibility to work with that money moving forward. But that's something we certainly can discuss, and I think it's probably something we should talk about, establishing some guidelines on how you manage that moving forward. And maybe that'll come out of the strategic planning as well.
So in the committed area, I thought that the 12 million for retiree benefits, and this is just the format we were using last year, but I thought there was two pieces of that. One was the PSERS commitment, and then the other was the health benefits that we would pay,
Yeah, the severances, I believe, are when someone retires and you're paying, additional sick days and time for that. I believe the retiree benefits are probably a combination of both PSERS and healthcare commitments.
Healthcare, okay. Okay. So,
Capital Reserve Fund, again, a little over $10 million, almost $10.5 million sitting in there right now.
Doug, I just have one question on that
Sure.
previous slide.
Sure.
That 12 million, I mean, we've kicked this around for, many years. Is that the right number? Do we need to keep that in reserve? And I guess, what's your view on how we should go through that process and determine what's really needed there? Because I think that number's been there for a long time.
Yeah, it
We've
has
never
been.
tapped into it.
It has been.
So, we've got it sitting there for retiree benefits, but the likelihood that we're going to use it probably isn't very high. So
I agree.
we should either pull it out of there, move it
My
into capital,
recommendation is-
reassign it to something else,
Yeah.
maybe.
My recommendation would be to look at what your true health care commitments are going to be in the future, and then remove the PSERS portion of it. I think a lot of school districts put money aside for PSERS, and smartly so, because the rates were increasing at exponential rate levels that we hadn't seen before. But I think that's kind of stabilized now. I think the prudent thing would be, let's look at what your actual obligations are for your contracts in providing health care till people reach age
Yes.
65.
Yep.
And that's the number that should be in there. It should not be the PSERS number.
Right, okay.
So, yeah, we can work with the auditor to kind of get to that. You do an actuary assessment of that with GASB 75 every 2 years. So I can certainly work with Conrad Siegel to try to get a number that's a little closer to where we should be.
That'd be perfect. At least
Yeah.
we've got some documentation. We've gone
Right.
through the calculation. We've estimated what our our real risk is or obligation.
Right.
And we've set that aside. Right now, I think it's just a little bit arbitrary. We've just been putting more money in that fund,
I agree.
but it's not based on any estimate or data.
I agree. All right. The Capital Reserve Fund, this is my projections for the end of this year. Right now, I have estimated revenue of slightly under 600,000. We still, and you'll see on the board agenda this month, some intra-fund transfers. It will be these amounts for the turf replacement, the bus replacements, and the paving projects. You had budgeted to do this when you created this year's budget in the general fund. So it takes I don't know if you've done it in the past, but you should do board action to do those types of transfers since you're moving from one fund to another. So you'll see a motion on this month's agenda to move that money into the Capital Reserve Fund. So that's the bulk of your revenue. You have some interest income. What have we spent out of that fund this year? We replaced several buses. We had the track work that was being completed this year. We did some site monitoring. We have some hill sliding issues that they monitor on it for us every month. You have your feasibility study, and then you have some HVAC controls that we're taking care of. So you're spending about 1.2 million, which means you'll end with about $9.78 million at the end of this year. Next year, with that beginning fund balance, I'm anticipating revenues of 1.5 million. The biggest portion of that, again, continuing the turf replacement and the bus replacement transfers, but also transferring some of the ESSER's money so that we can do some of those capital projects that we talked about with the windows and the water issues and many of the things that were on the feasibility study report. Where do I think I'm going to spend the money? Again, those things, we're going to do some security upgrades. We talked about a number of the cameras that are not functioning. We've come up with a plan to address that. We want to address the immediate needs for the outside of the high school, but we also have other upgrades. We're trying to move to an online system that's much easier to manage. We do have to worry about some cautions with people being able to hack into our system, so we're working with the tech department and the security company to see how we can work around those things. We have paving that has to be done, and then we're going to do some sign replacement here at IMS, that's the sign out by the road, and the sign out here at administration as well. We're also talking about replacing the sign that's on the building at NAM so it's much more visible and it identifies the school in a better way. So those are some of the things we're talking about doing. We really are kind of crunched for a timeline, but we'll talk about that in a board meeting as far as how we're going to proceed with that work and the timeline for getting all that done. Again, we have a whole list. Nick and I have started to develop a 5-year capital projects plan. So we have started to list out all the projects that we think we're going to see over the next 5 years and try to put some cost estimates to them. We haven't finished it. We've done at least 2 good years, but we're trying to work it out to 5 years. But we want to have a good sense of what do we need to maintain that capital reserve at so that we can always have the funding there we need to do those types of projects. But we have to plan into the future because we know we're going to have paving that eventually is going to need to be done at the high school and IMS. So we don't want to wait till it's so bad that we don't have it. We want to make sure we're timing these things appropriately. We know we're going to have to replace the turf. Right now, we have some issues with the practice field turf. Some of the seams where they have lines, the glue's giving. So we're going to have to put a little bit of money into repairing that. We might be coming to you with like a maintenance contract that might, since that turf warranty has expired, to a minimal warranty where we can have those things replaced at a minimal cost. We're looking into that right now. But again, eventually you're going to need to replace the high school stadium turf down the road, probably not in the near future, but maybe 5 years down the road it might need replaced. And we want to make sure we have the funds in there that are already been reserved to do those projects when they need to be done. but we can't get there unless we plan it out.
Something that you might consider putting on your list for, I don't know when, but the rec department and the municipality has been asking for years, ever since the high school was built, to put a restroom, concession stand facility, new third field at the high school. And the softball field.
I actually have that on the list because the softball field came up and then we said the turf field.
Thank you.
I think there's water there, so. Right.
The recreation department uses it also, and they really would like a restroom facility out in the porta johns and a concession stand. And it would be something for, community day and different things like that. But it's been asked for since the high school was built. And, I'm not pushing it, but I'm just saying, please put that on the list somewhere.
Yeah,
Mr. McClausman, I'm going to push for it. I'm going to push for it.
Yeah, no problem.
As somebody that's had to use that field and then take a toddler to the porta johns, not a pretty picture. The other thing is too, there are some potential businesses, if we would be willing to do sponsorships, naming, those kinds of things. We can talk later offline. I had already gone out and, as a booster parent, sported all that and started that process and do have some contacts with that. But the pandemic hit and nobody was building anything.
right.
I think, talking with somebody in the municipality, I believe there's somebody lined up who's willing to jump into that.
Yeah, I think,
Initiate it.
I think the problem is it's a lot more expensive than you realize. Is anybody familiar with Nevillewood? You know, Nevillewood area. There's a little playground down the road coming back towards Heidelberg. There's a modular, and I was in the modular business, but I had nothing to do with this company. It's really weird though. The company I used to work for like 50 years ago, not quite, but close. It's called LB Foster Company. They make a concrete structure, that is very indestructible. I don't know how much it costs, but it's a restroom facility there, and I'm sure they have other options. And I would highly recommend you looking at that because of the security nature and there's no sense putting something up there that's not going to last and it's going to get destroyed.
But see, it's even talking with the borough between their skilled labor and our skilled labor. Is it something, or like I said, like you said, Russ, bring a structure in. But like Mrs. Doba said, I think that we're at that point right now. The borough municipality recognizes they need it. We find the value of it. I think we're in a really good timing to move forward. Hopefully, even like sometime even this year.
Way back when we still had the auxiliary gym,
Yeah.
they were talking about putting in a facility back then. I
Yeah.
think you probably remember that, Jim. And I remember the cost back then was very significant.
Yeah.
And I'm not downplaying it. I'm just telling you we need to be.
But I think.
But we already have water that goes 3/4 of the way
I'm
up.
pretty sure we have water and power.
No,
right
I
there.
think
have
we
water
have the
and-
utilities there.
Yeah, let's.
Sorry, my bad.
How about if we,
Remember, it's going out that way too, so that.
let's-
Make sure you get
people
that
hear
in
that.
this year's budget.
Sorry,
yeah,
It's on the
let's
sorry.
pull this conversation out of the toilet and let's move on, okay? Next
Excellent.
topic.
So again, this is just a list. We've talked about them already, potential projects for the coming school year. We've talked about gym floor at IMS, the water issues at the high school and IMS, the signs, the marquees, the cameras. We talked about a secure vestibule possibly being constructed at IMS, the IMS water line, the window replacements, and the paving. So. And there is your fund balance numbers for the capital reserve.
I guess just one question on this list. Have you used any of the things that Hayes? Group
Yes, many of
put
those
together?
things that are in the
Okay.
Hayes
So
project are
Kind
on
of using
there.
that as the reference of, okay, perfect, yeah.
Yep. So there's the summary where we're at one more time. You can see I kind of reworked some of the committed a little bit. Again, kind of thinking we were probably going to adjust that number. They don't have to stay there. It will require your action anyhow before we make an adjustment. But the total is the total. Where they end up as far as committed and assigned are still up for grabs. But those were my best guesses at the time. Where would it go from now? From here until May, we'll continue to make changes. I'm still waiting on, I'll get new assessed values from Allegheny County after May 1st because the certified homestead exclusions will come out with the updated assessed values. So you might see some changes that could be significant in there. Again, insurance renewals are due back, so I only have estimates in there right now. We'll continue to evaluate staffing numbers and wait for the final number on retirements. And then I'm still working on analyzing budget versus actual variances. I'm running some different reports in Forecast 5 now that are showing me where we've hit targets in the past, where we haven't hit targets, and I'm trying to drill down to evaluate what's happening so I can identify those things. So there might be some tweaks there. I'm still fairly confident with the potential cuts. We're going to get very close to being balanced with a tax increase. So that's my goal for May. I can't promise it, but that is where I think we can get to if we really work hard in the next month. So proposed final budget will be presented in May. It will be put on public review at that point, and then you have until the end of June, so probably your voting meeting in June, we will be ready to adopt the final budget for the next school year. That's the target.
So, I'm sorry, I should have asked this earlier. but
Sure.
There's a slide that says capital reserve fund balance where you say future capital projects, $7,613,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if I go to the previous slide 2 before that, we have 9 million in that. So
Yeah, that's just,
not using all but 2 million of it?
yeah, I mean, that doesn't that's just where I think you'll be, that number doesn't see, you're right, well, no, that's just the line item, but if you add up the 910, the 774, the 250, and the 716, you're going to get to that 9,000,005 number.
Okay.
I just didn't total it on that side, I'm sorry. Does that make sense?
No, I just mean we're planning on depleting of capital reserve.
No. Right here, if you look on this slide up here, there's $9.5 million at the end of next year.
Right.
I just took that $9.5 million and I broke it down, and this is how it's categorized.
But doesn't that deplete that $9 million?
No, this is what you end up with. If you add those numbers up, you're going to get that 9.5
And it says
million.
future capital projects on there. It's not capital projects we're doing in that year.
It's pretty much, that 7.6 million is sitting there for undesignated projects. But I put some ideas of what we're going to continue to do in the future.
I just was, if we're gonna,
All right, let me,
if we're gonna use the $9 million with
No.
all of these projects, how do we then?
right here is, on this slide, Mrs. Dobos, we start with 9.7. We're going to add 1.5. We're going to spend 1.7. So we've really only depleted that fund balance by $200,000 next year.
So the 7 million future capital projects.
If you think about when we talked about general fund, some of it's committed, some of it's assigned, some of it's undesignated. All this slide is showing you basically that you have already earmarked of that 9.5 million, 910 for turf replacement in the future, 774,000 for bus replacement in the future, 250 for paving projects in the future, and then 7.6 million of that $9.5 million is sitting there for whatever else you want to use it for. It's not, that's what I project you'll end up with at the end of next year. At the end of next year. So you have $9.5 million sitting there.
So in other
And what
words,
you'll continue to do in the future as we build that long project is you'll continue to make transfers from the general fund into your capital reserve so you can replenish that as you're spending it down. So you want to keep that at a level where you're still able to fund projects into the future, but you need to have a good idea of how you're going to spend it. Because technically, if you have a capital reserve, the state wants to know that you have a plan on how you're going to spend it down. And I haven't seen that, so that's what we're trying to develop, is that plan for how we're going to fund those needs into the future. Hopefully, it will be able to help you avoid doing a large bond issue in the future if we can use some of this money to help fund those projects without having to take on additional debt.
Well,
That's
So,
the
I think
goal.
that's
so
some
in
of
other
that-
words, I'm sorry, the 7.6 is what we have left over after we spend what we're planning on spending. And then the projects under it are just things that we may be
Well,
able, or may
actually-
use that towards.
Yeah, actually, if you add the 7.6, the 250,000, the 774, and the 910, you're at $9.5 million.
Right. I think the way this was put out there, correct me if I'm wrong, the confusion was future capital projects
Yeah.
being listed at 7.6, and then those potential future
Yeah.
capital projects.
You're correct.
It gave us the impression that.
Yeah, you're
That
right.
was being
I'm
spent.
really just saying, that's all earmarked, and these are potential projects that
Right.
we might do.
But I think this is where part of that evaluation of where the PSERS and the retiree healthcare comes in. Because when you look at our capital fund, in some ways, we're, I wouldn't say in a deficit, but the number isn't as good as it looks, the $10 million, because we haven't done any big projects in the last 5 years. We cut a lot of those. And,
Those things are necessary.
Oh.
Future capital projects,
Yeah.
they're necessary.
But we
Right, but they may not-
saw a lot of things, well, yeah, like the HVAC updates, and we had HVAC updates at Franklin that, they were on the table 5 years ago and we pulled them off and we
Well,
didn't do
and
them.
one of the things that came up as we started building that more today was, keep in mind that a lot of your buildings, like IMS and NAMS, aren't ADA compliant in many areas.
Right.
So when you start to do renovations on those buildings, you are going to need to think about bringing those up to ADA code. So
And that's in
that
the-
could
that's
get
in
you
the Hayes
rather
report.
expensive. That could
That's
get
all in the
rather
Hayes report.
expensive.
Yeah, I mean, just like PSERS was the threat that was going to kill us 10 years ago, right now, our long list of capital projects are going to creep up on us pretty quickly also.
Yeah.
We have a chance to knock some of them out of the way paying cash versus eventually, if something has to happen down the road, there may be a bond that has to be taken out. But at least some of these things, we have money on hand, because again, the retirement fund is what, 11?
12 million between PSERS and retiree
So
healthcare.
as we narrow that down to what that truly should be, some of these things, like I said, I've seen is we just pay cash and get them out of the way. And then as we get forward to
Yeah.
making that decision about what this district's gonna look like building-wise, and then ADA, then that's where the bond comes under.
And remember, you had, $3 million sitting in the general fund for capital projects, so that's money that you could transfer in to replenish this as you need it. So you have some options, which is nice that you have a little bit of flexibility, but really, your strategic planning into the future is really how you're going to avoid those crises and really staying focused on that plan and how you're going to manage it moving forward is going to be critical, especially when we talk about the finance committee in that group. That's got to be some of the focus we look at.
Right.
So the good thing is then if projects that come up as we'll discuss next week, we'll at least we'll have the funds immediately to start moving forward with them, correct?
Well, Doug, the other thing too, I think that you've also introduced some other things like the leasing aspect and things like that you're not going to see that all at one time. There's going to be a savings over time. So there's going to be,
Right.
you're going to recoup that over 2,
Right.
3, 4 years.
Yeah, you're not going to see spikes
right.
in your
Right,
budget.
so we don't know that number just yet, but there is going to be other,
Right.
a reversal of money going out versus,
Yeah, I mean, the more we can build those types of plans into our budget process and management process, it's going to help us way into the future of being able to plan strategically on whether that's something we really need to do and how we're going to fund it. We want to be able to answer those questions pretty readily.
Well, Doug, I have to tell you, I've sat through thousands of budget meetings, and I want to tell you that you've done a great job, and it's going to be great for the new people because the budget's laid out so well. It's formatted in such easy language that it's going to be real helpful to the new people. I think it's a job well done in all those sessions I've sat in.
Thank you.
Yeah, Doug, fantastic job.
Yes.
Thank you, Doug.
Welcome. That's it? And also in your handout, I didn't go over it here, but you have a lot, you have like you have probably 6 additional pages that really give you a little more detailed breakdown of the numbers. It gives you, I believe, 4 years of actuals. It gives you where you budgeted, where I'm estimating this year to end. You have a summary page, you have a breakdown of revenues, and you have a breakdown of expenditures by their different areas. So if you have any, when you're looking through that and you have any questions, just, shoot me an email or give me a call. I'll try to explain it.
Hey,
There's
Doug,
no
this is
quiz.
Darren.
There's
I
no
agree.
quiz.
Thank
That's
you very
next
much.
Tuesday.
I'm sorry, Darren, did you have something to say?
I said I agree with everyone else. This looks great.
Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, I fully understood everything you were talking about, which is amazing, because I'm not a numbers guy like you and Barry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So do you expect that we'll have another finance meeting like this, or are we just going to put it on the board agenda for May, probably?
I would suspect unless something unusual happens, we probably can proceed to presenting it at the agenda meeting at the next budget, the next meeting, the first meeting in May.
Yeah.
And then hopefully approving it at the second meeting.
Yep.
I'll have to look at the timing and how the dates work out.
Sure.
As far as that goes. If
Okay.
it's not going to give us enough time, 30 days between the May meeting and the June meeting, we may have to bump it up, and maybe you will want to have a finance meeting
Okay.
to go over it, if we have to approve it at the agenda meeting.
Okay.
So let me look at the schedule. I haven't looked at the calendar.
Okay. Sounds good. Any other comments, questions?
No, I just want to say thank you, Doug. I really do like how you presented it, how you put everything together. Really like the fact that the zero-based budget, even with the contention on staffing, I do like that, and how we brought our numbers closer to reality as opposed to padding the budget. It makes it a lot easier, not only for you guys to make spending decisions, but for us, like you said, to make those decisions when we actually know what we're working with. So I appreciate everything you've done, how you've put it together, and how you've presented it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. We're done kind of early. You want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, how about dinner? I want to.
Sounds good. Let's talk about that.